I know it's been closed for several months, but I just cannot get over how awkward the title Pirates the Penzance Musical is. If you don't know the full context, Pirates the Penzance Musical is the bumpy title of the bumpy revival of Gilbert and Sullivan's The Pirates of Penzance, which played a 4-month run on Broadway this past spring and summer. The title is an indication to audiences that this is not a standard repertory production of the G&S operetta, but a fresh adaptation with a new book, lyrics, and orchestrations, moving the setting of the show from the English coast to the French Quarter of New Orleans, and vastly revising the plot.
Pirates the Penzance musical as opposed to the Pirates of Penzance.
Just meant to, I guess, pique people's curiosity, but also give a little sense to people who know the show what we're talking about.
There's absolutely no Penzance in it.
There is no Penzance in it.
I'll talk about the changes that were made later on, but for now, let's focus on that title. There's something inherently off about it, the process coming through in the final product just a little too much. Obviously, calling this production The Pirates of Penzance wouldn't be appropriate, given how many edits have been made. You'd risk fans of the original 1879 operetta turning up, only to find something entirely different. But if you give this musical an entirely unique title, then you risk losing out on the name recognition of The Pirates of Penzance, inarguably the most famous work by Gilbert and Sullivan. Thus, this new title, containing 3 of the same 4 words, plus a qualifying noun that is less a term of craft in this context, but rather, as we've discussed on this channel before, more of a promise to audiences that the show will be upbeat and entertaining above all else. And then, in the middle, to drive that point home, big exclamation mark. If I were to paraphrase the intention of this name, it would be, please recognize this title that you may have heard of, but do not think it's going to be boring like you may have heard of. It is a name that is defensive right out of the gate. And that defensiveness runs through all conversations around Pirates the Penzance musical. Over and over again, the writers and actors were insistent that, while they loved Gilbert and Sullivan, an update was sorely needed.
Gilbert and Sullivan is some of the most delightful music you'll ever hear, but it was written a long time ago.
Yeah.
And we know that some young people have a hard time embracing things from the past.
I feel like stuff like Gilbert and Sullivan can feel very unattainable, or like it's not for them, specifically for like young kids of color.
You know, to take the risk of doing a new version of Pirates of Penzance. I mean, it hasn't been on Broadway in over 40 years, but then to take it and set it in New Orleans and add a jazzier element is a bit of a risk, and luckily it's paid off.
Of course, while the company will mention that there was a previous revival of Pirates 40 years ago, they don't mention just how important that revival was. The New York Shakespeare Festival production of The Pirates of Penzance is, one could argue, the most influential production of the operetta in its nearly 150-year history. No other staging of the piece has had as fundamental an impact on the material, in terms of breaking down traditions, setting new goalposts to meet, and popularizing the work far beyond its intended audience. Originally planned for a limited run in the summer of 1980, the production ended up running 2 years on Broadway, spawned a national tour and a film adaptation, and established several performance traditions still followed today. If you're watching this video as a musical theater fan, and you don't know any other Gilbert and Sullivan operettas, but you do know The Pirates of Penzance, no exaggeration, this revival is why. Longtime viewers of my channel might also know that I already made a video about the 1980 Pirates revival back in 2020, but things have certainly evolved since then, both in terms of my own writing and research getting stronger, and in terms of, well, finally getting another version of the show on Broadway. So, while this video began as a simple remake of that older video, this quickly went off course and became its own entirely distinct essay. I'm leaving the old video up, but make no mistake, this is the fuller, more complete picture of the revival and its aftermath. And so, before the memory of Pirates the Penzance musical fades into Broadway lore, let's take a look back at the New York Shakespeare Festival's 1980 revival, how it came to be, what its long-term impact was, and how deceptively simple it can be to turn a delicate operetta into a swashbuckling musical. The history of the Pirates of Penzance actually begins with a story of real-life pirates. Not of the high seas, though. Of intellectual property. In 1878, librettist W.S. Gilbert and composer Arthur Sullivan were having the biggest success of their careers, with the premiere of their fourth collaboration, the operetta HMS Pinafore. Running for more than 500 performances in London, the show should have been a cause for much celebration for the writers, as well as for the impresario Richard D'Oyley Carte, who had supported them. However, there were two major issues around Pinafore that would need to be solved before their next operetta could premiere, one domestic and one international. Domestically, D'Oyley Carte didn't just see Gilbert and Sullivan as strong writers with a growing and successful canon of works. They were an integral part of his larger goal as a producer, establishing a new movement of English light entertainment which could compete with French imports like burlesque. D'Oyley Carte had incorporated a syndicate of like-minded producers, forming the Comedy Opera Company in 1876, explicitly to support these two writers. However, when Pinafore became a bigger success than expected, D'Oyley Carte decided to cut out the other producers, striking a new agreement for a new company in which he, Sullivan, and Gilbert would each have an even three-way split of the profits. That new company, the D'Oyley Carte Opera Company, was founded in 1879 and remained the preeminent authority on Gilbert and Sullivan's operettas all the way into the 20th century. And their first production under the new banner would be the Pirates of Penzance. But across international waters, another problem was brewing. See, while Pinafore was a massive financial success for Gilbert and Sullivan, it was only productions in the UK that paid them for their work. At the time, the United States had no law on the books covering foreign copyrights, so pirated productions of HMS Pinafore began popping up all over the country. D'Oyley Carte did eventually transfer an official production over to New York to secure an American copyright, but the piracy proliferated faster than he could stomp them down. It was for this reason that Gilbert and Sullivan's next operetta would be their first and only work to technically debut on American soil. On December 30th, 1879, the London cast of Pinafore sung through the score of the newer piece in a bare minimum concert that occurred just to secure the English copyright. And the following day, on December 31st, New York's Fifth Avenue Theater hosted the fully staged world premiere of The Pirates of Penzance. The Pirates of Penzance, or The Slave of Duty, falls squarely into the G&S mold, a comical satire of the English class system in which the characters attempt to resolve a ludicrous scenario in the most logical manner possible. Our protagonist is Frederick, a young sailor who has spent his life as the apprentice to a pirate crew led by the Pirate King. After turning 21, he leaves the crew and immediately runs across a beach full of beautiful young women, falling in love with one of them, named Mabel. From there, a series of hijinks ensue, involving a vow not to harm any orphans, a shockingly cowardly police squadron, a contract loophole about being born on a leap day, and one modern major general.
I am the very model of a modern major general, life information, vegetable, animal, and mineral.
The Pirates of Penzance was a hit from the very beginning, running 100 performances in New York and, once the full production opened, 363 performances in London. And, despite successfully securing the American copyright on the work, illegal productions continued to happen anyway. While the new operetta was never quite as successful as Pinafore, and both would be later eclipsed by the success of Patience and The Mikado, Pirates was added to the rotating repertory of the D'Oyley Carte Opera Company in 1893, where it remained for the next 90 years. Even beyond the Savoyards, the term for Gilbert and Sullivan aficionados, Pirates managed to achieve cultural staying power, enough for some of its songs to become known to the general public. In particular, Modern Major General became the show's breakout hit, and arguably the most famous patter song of all time, so well enough known that it would eventually be parodied everywhere.
I am the very model of a modern major general. I've information, vegetable, animal, and mineral.
I'm quite good at genetics as a subset of biology.
From wicked puns and stupid jokes to anvils that drop on your head.
Considered to be solidly in the upper half of the G&S canon, Pirates continued to be staged throughout the 20th century. Between 1900 and 1979, the show saw 24 limited runs on Broadway, sometimes staged by the D'Oyley Carte itself, but just as often staged by local producers. In amateur companies, the piece also remained popular, remaining in the core canon of light opera works, even as the medium of light opera continued to be driven out of popularity by the mid-20th century rise of American musical theater. Still, the D'Oyley Carte Opera Company continued to perform the show in rep, inspiring hundreds of Savoyards to form Gilbert and Sullivan societies to keep the pieces alive. Finally, when the American copyright on the operetta expired in 1961, it became even easier and cheaper to bring the Pirates of Penzance to the stage, which is exactly what Joseph Papp of the Public Theater was planning to do. Exactly 100 years and 19 days after the debut of Pirates, news broke that New York Mayor Ed Koch was planning a drastic reduction in funding for the arts. Specifically, a grant supporting free performances by arts organizations in Central Park, as well as in smaller parks around the city, would be slashed from $1.6 million down to just $150,000. And one of the groups hit hardest by these cuts was the New York Shakespeare Festival, a program of the Off-Broadway Public Theater and headed by the legendary producer Joseph Papp. Papp had gone toe-to-toe with 5 of the last 5 mayors of New York to advocate for city funding, believing that the New York Shakespeare Festival, which staged 2 free theater productions each summer at the outdoor Delacorte Theater in Central Park, was providing a civic good that was worthy of government support. Naturally, Papp was outraged by the proposed budget. Not only was the budget a downgrade from the previous season, but the public theater's finances were already tight as it was. As a supporter of new plays and living playwrights, the company was often in shaky financial shape, but had been enjoying a brief run of stability following the unexpected success of A Chorus Line.
5, 6, 7, 8!
After debuting at the public, Chorus Line moved to Broadway in 1976 and continued to turn a profit, helping the public survive. But with a downturn in ticket sales over the summer and fall of 1979, this was perhaps the worst possible time for the city to trim funding to the company. As it happened, Papp had announced his plans for the 1980s summer season only 2 days before these budget cuts were announced. One play was a yet-to-be-determined Shakespeare comedy. The New York Times listed Twelfth Night, Midsummer, and Love's Labour's Lost as the possible options, and the other was, surprisingly, The Pirates of Penzance. In response to the budget cuts, Papp would have to trim this season down to 1 play only. Papp decided that if the mayor didn't value Shakespeare, then there would be no Shakespeare, and, in protest, cut the comedy from the season. That left Pirates as the sole programming at the Delacorte, the first summer season with only 1 play since 1959. Now, the NYSF had been talking about doing a Gilbert and Sullivan piece at the Delacorte for at least 2 seasons prior to this announcement, but initially it was not Pirates that Papp had his eye on, but The Mikado. Papp had performed in the piece in high school and had fond memories of it. In a conversation with director Wilford Leach, who directed at the Delacorte in 1978 and 79, Papp told him to look up The Mikado in anticipation of directing it the next summer. According to Leach,
I went to Barnes & Noble, which had only 2 or 3 Gilbert and Sullivan 2 record sets. I had enough money to buy only 1 pair of records, and I thought, the jacket of Pirates of Penzance is terrific, and the other ones look so boring. And that's the truth of it.
After listening to only the second half of the second act, Leach was hooked, and immediately called music director Bill Elliott to inform him that The Pirates of Penzance would be performed at the Delacorte that coming summer. However, the production would not employ a cast of operatic singers. Papp's original choice for the Pirate King was NYSF regular Raoul Julia, who'd performed in the last 3 summer seasons at the Delacorte, including the Threepenny Opera and The Taming of the Shrew. However, shortly after his casting was announced, Julia had to drop out of the show after being cast in Francis Ford Coppola's One from the Heart. A replacement would not come until June, when the role was given to founding member of the City Center's acting company and 1978 Tony Award winner Kevin Kline.
Oh, better far to live and die under the brave black flag I fly than play a sanctimonious part with a pirate head and a pirate heart.
Announced at the same time was another Shakespeare Festival regular, George Rose, who would take on Major General Stanley, as well as Patricia Routledge as Frederick's nursemaid, Ruth. Incidentally, this video is dedicated to Patricia Routledge, as she passed away during the scripting of this video. On the whole, Leach's vision was to avoid the Savoyard rulebook as much as possible, while still giving respect to the quality of the material. As he explained it,
the tradition of Gilbert and Sullivan is that you do it according to a set of stage directions which the doily cart people will happily supply you with. Well, that doesn't interest me. I'm interested in it before it was a classic, thinking about how people experienced it when it was a new play. My interest was to say, how can I get a contemporary audience to experience something like that first night when it was fresh, when it was not this thing distanced by a vocal style that is no longer appropriate? How do you eliminate the distancing?
Leach further described Gilbert and Sullivan's score as the pop music of its day, and as such, looked to the world of 1970s pop music to cast the lovers, Mabel and Frederick. For Mabel, Papp had already made a connection with Linda Ronstadt, one of the most celebrated rock vocalists of the 1970s. Inspired by a string of concerts she did in smaller European venues, Ronstadt was inspired to put together a show that was more theatrical in nature as opposed to a standard concert, which led to a conversation with Joe Papp about a potential collaboration with the public. That idea would end up faltering, but it put Ronstadt on Papp's radar and made her his first choice when Leach asked for rock singers who could potentially play Mabel. After confirming her interest, Ronstadt was cast without an audition, though she did initially think she was being cast in HMS Pinafore before being corrected. For Frederick, however, Leach decided to make a cold call to a rock star with Broadway experience. Rex Smith, a rock vocalist from Atlanta who was also a former replacement for Danny Zuko in Grease. Smith was flown out to New York to meet with Leach, and the meeting went about as well as one could hope.
What is this thing?
Gilbert and Sullivan.
What's that?
Well, I can tell you about the role. It's like Errol Flynn.
Oh, good. I can do that.
And what makes you think you can do that?
Oh, I have Errol Flynn's picture in my wallet.
And he took out his wallet, and be damned, he had a picture of Errol Flynn. Why are you carrying that?
Because I intend to swash until I buckle.
You are Frederick. Anybody who would say that with a straight face and mean it is him.
That Smith could also belt a high B-flat on command didn't hurt.
However plain you'll be, I'll love you.
The contemporary sound of the vocalists would be matched by a contemporary orchestration arranged by Bill Elliott. Critics at the time, both before and after the show opened, commented on the reduction of the orchestra, with a pit of 11 players relying heavily on brass instruments and only one string instrument, a double bass. According to Elliott, this was as much an artistic decision as a budget one. The Shakespeare Festival could only afford so many musicians. New York Times critic Frank Rich began his review questioning the very idea of the show, asking why Gilbert and Sullivan was being performed by
two American rock singers, surrounded by an eclectic crew of Broadway and West End actors, all belting to the electronic strains of a small, stringless pit band.
However, as he said only one line later,
if this Pirates of Penzance at first seems like a misbegotten ship of fools, I'll be damned if it doesn't sail.
Reviews were enormously positive, with particular praise given to Klein's athletic, boisterous pirate king, Rose's properly mad major general, and the loose-limbed histrionics of Tony Azito, another Shakespeare Festival regular, who took the role of the sergeant of police. Quoting Frank Rich again,
the show's seemingly ill-matched parts evenly come together to form a crazy quilt of rambunctious merriment. Though Leach and Elliott have kidded around with Gilbert and Sullivan a bit, they have not transformed the show into a rock musical or, God forbid, attempted to update it. In the ways that really count, this production upholds the spirit and often the letter of the original.
Harold C. Schonberg, the Times chief music critic, also commented on the show, calling it
a sparkling, amusing, clever Pirates. Musically, it was top-notch, granted its premise. William Elliott, who conducted and reorchestrated the score, had seen to it that this was a tight, meticulously delivered performance, and while the dancing was completely out of tradition, that too worked.
Given the unexpectedly strong response, Pirates transferred to the Uris Theater on Broadway in January 1981 and would end up running for nearly 2 years, its 787 performances being the longest unbroken run for any Gilbert and Sullivan operetta in history at the time. In fact, that's more than the combined performances of all 25 other Broadway productions of The Pirates of Penzance before and since. At the 35th Tony Awards, Pirates was nominated for 7 awards and won 3. Leach for Director of a Musical, Klein for Lead Actor in a Musical, and Best Reproduction, the equivalent today of Best Revival.
And this extraordinary company that took a 100-year-old classic and turned it into the very model of a modern major musical. Thank you very much.
All in all, the New York Shakespeare Festival had transformed The Pirates of Penzance from a Victorian museum piece into a bona fide Broadway hit, and invigorated a renewed interest for the works of Gilbert and Sullivan. As Frank Rich wrote in his review of the Broadway transfer,
New York's affection for The Pirates of Penzance is unlikely to remain merely a summertime crush. This is the beginning of a full-blown love affair that just may last for years.
Or so it may have seemed. Following Papp's Pirates, as the production was commonly known, the 20th century saw only one other GNS operetta make it to Broadway, a limited-run transfer of the Stratford Festival's Mikado in 1987. As it turns out, after Pirates closed in November 1982, it would take 4 decades before the show would find itself sailing back to Broadway. On October 17, 2022, a one-night-only concert was held at the American Airlines Theater, now the Todd Haynes Theater, on Broadway. The concert, a benefit event for the Off-Broadway Roundabout Theater Company, who operated the venue, was the first public step in a long-awaited revival of the Pirates of Penzance. However, this production would not be Pirates as it debuted in 1879, nor the revitalized production of the 1980s. This new Pirates promised a new adaptation by playwright Rupert Holmes, author of The Mystery of Edwin Drood, and revised orchestrations by Joseph Joubert and Darrell Waters, transferring the action to New Orleans. This was rooted in the true history of the area, which saw a spike in piratical activity in the 1870s, around the time that Pirates was debuting in New York. The cast would include Ramin Karimloo as the Pirate King, David Hyde Pierce as the Major General, and Lily Cooper as Ruth. From the beginning, the reading was announced as the first step in a Broadway-aimed revival, though it would take until January 2024 for another step to be taken. That month, Roundabout announced their upcoming season, which included the long-awaited revival of the Pirates of Penzance on Broadway. While Karimloo and Pierce were confirmed to be returning from the initial announcement, full casting was not revealed until the following November. Nicholas Barish as Frederick, Samantha Williams as Mabel, and Jinx Monsoon as Ruth. It was also at this time that the production announced its revised title, no longer The Pirates of Penzance, but now Pirates the Penzance Musical. Also, if I could just say for a second, I support the decision to rename this show. Not necessarily the name that they went with, as I've already discussed.
There's absolutely no Penzance in it.
There is no Penzance in it.
But the decision to rename it, the realization of we've changed so much about the plot, score, and purpose of the show that calling it The Pirates of Penzance would be advertising something that we are not going to deliver. As far as making sure that the audience is informed about the plan here, I think that was the right decision. But about those rewrites, Rupert Holmes's rewrites were extensive, overhauling not only the setting but also a majority of the show's original dialogue and some of its core plot points. The Pirate King, now named Santiago, harbors a grudge against the English and Major General Stanley specifically for the capture and death of his father, a previous Pirate King. The end of Act 1 group number Hail Poetry is rebranded as Hail Liberty, a praise of the American ideals of freedom. There was also an all-cast washboard dance during the new Act 1 finale. Not sure if that's a Holmes decision, but it certainly wasn't in the original. That's not the only adjustment to the score. Frederick's new introduction to Act 1 and the Major General's new Act 2 opener are both from the GNS operetta Iolanthe, plus a new song added for Ruth from the Mikado, plus new finales for Act 1 and Act 2, both added from Pinafore. These supplant the several songs cut from the show, including Oh False One, How Beautifully Blue the Sky, and Stay Frederick Stay. There are also songs that have had their lyrics completely rewritten despite serving the same plot purpose, like Oh Better Far to Live and Die. And all of these adjustments are only to the show within the show, situated within a new framing device. Very basically, Holmes and director Scott Ellis were inspired by the quirk of history that Pirates had debuted on American soil, and that the show actually went on something of an American tour following that production, including a stop in New Orleans. So here's the new concept for the show. What if, stay with me here, what if Gilbert and Sullivan, having brought Pirates to New Orleans in 1880, were so taken by the culture there that they decided to rewrite huge portions of the show to formally set the story there, including adding in songs from operettas that they had not yet written, utterly torpedoing the piece's original critiques about the English class system in order to do that, and also decided that both of them, Gilbert and Sullivan themselves, would also be in the show as actors, playing the Major General and Police Sergeant respectively. I know that may sound like a heavy concept to put onto this show, requiring a lot of explanation to audiences to understand that they're walking off 42nd Street in 2025 and into a New Orleans theater in 1880. So the show kindly had Gilbert and Sullivan themselves walk out on stage at the start to verbally explain that concept to the audience again.
Pirates! Hello! Formerly of Penzance, but for tonight, reconceived in and for the city. of New Orleans.
Now, obviously, I'm being a little sassy and judgmental here about the massive amount of edits required to transform the Pirates of Penzance into Pirates the Penzance musical. But editing a public domain script is 100% allowed, and as we'll get into in the next section, it's not like the 1980 production was without textual adjustment, though not nearly as much. The main question we should be asking is, did this work? Did the rewrites and added songs and new framing device and Mardi Gras vibes turn the show into a hit? I can't say. Literally, I can't say because I did not see Pirates the Penzance musical, so I cannot comment firsthand on whether the show was good or not. I have secondhand accounts, and I'll quote them soon, but I want to be explicit about this. I cannot make a judgment call in this video on whether Pirates the Penzance musical was good or bad. If you saw the show and loved it, then great. Your opinion on this matter is more valuable than mine. My focus, instead, is on the intention given for all these changes. Why Ellis and Holmes and Gilbert and Waters felt that Pirates needed this significant a facelift. There were various reasons stated, but the central one they kept coming back to was this. The Pirates of Penzance is a 140-year-old operetta, and audiences just don't connect to something so old.
Scott Ellis came and said, you know, I went to a dinner at the Gilbert and Sullivan Society. Do you know anything about pirates? So I have some recollection, some knowledge of Gilbert and Sullivan in its classic form.
It was written a long time ago.
Yeah.
And we know that some young people have a hard time embracing things from the past.
Rupert Holmes made this explicit in an interview with Margaret Hall at Playbill.
I grew up on Gilbert and Sullivan, but I wanted to bring the show into a world that resonates now, where the music isn't just light operatic tradition, but something vibrant and alive, something people can feel in their bones.
We'll come back to that, but for now, put a pin in that intention. These changes were made in order to give the show renewed relevance for a contemporary audience. Always intended as a limited run, Pirates the Penzance musical ran for 4 months on Broadway, was nominated for a single Tony Award that it did not win, and closed this past July. And now, let's dig a little deeper into what these two productions actually changed in 1980 and 2025. But before we do that, we should look at what the performance traditions of the Pirates of Penzance were before Leach got involved. As mentioned, part of Leach's vision for Pirates at the Delacorte was to get as far away from the standard Savoyard playbook as possible, treating the material like a new work rather than as a classic. But it should really be emphasized how bold of a stance that was, especially for Gilbert and Sullivan. This is explained at length by Harold C. Schoenberg in the article I quoted before, a piece published 2 weeks after the opening of Papp's Pirates entitled, How Innovative Dare We Be with GNS? Schoenberg writes,
Gilbert and Sullivan fans are diehards. Tradition in grand opera is nothing against tradition in GNS, which has been handed down through the generations. We expect that tradition to be observed. Every tempo, every nuance, every inflection, every movement on stage has been committed to memory, and woe be unto him who departs from the holy text. Gilbert and Sullivan productions should be frozen history. We like it that way. It has to be that way.
What's important to remember here is that by 1980, these traditions were enforced by historical inertia, but not by law. The doily cart had maintained a vice-like control over the performance traditions of the GNS canon up through the 20th century, but in 1961, the score and libretto of Pirates entered the public domain, meaning that someone like Leach could decide to stage the piece without getting doily cart approval first. But despite this, so strong were the Savoyard traditions that it took 19 years post-copyright extension for a director to even attempt to throw the old rulebook out. With that said, though, with the rules thrown out, what did the Leach production actually change about Pirates in performance? The vocal style was an immediate standout to those familiar with the material. Following Eliot's reorchestrations that made the show more brassy, the musical theater performers treated Pirates like a musical comedy, allowing for more use of high belting and sharper diction than would be expected in an operatic style. Listen to a couple of direct comparisons of the vocal styles in a 1958 doily cart recording and the 1980 NYSF production.
paradox, a paradox, a most ingenious paradox. A paradox. A paradox, a paradox, a most ingenious paradox. Paradox. Every moment brings a treasure of its own especial pleasure. Every moment brings a treasure of its own especial pleasure.
Still, despite the more contemporary vocal style, there was very little rearranging of the score done. Linda Ronstadt made it a point of pride to learn the older operatic style in order to sing Mabel, and would sing as many of the songs as she could in the original soprano keys. She did end up adjusting a few of the solos down, but only by 2.5 steps at most. Rex Smith was apparently worried that his fans would be upset if he didn't bring his rock star vocals to the show, but aside from a small Elvis impression at the end of one song, his voice was matched quite aptly to the material. Perhaps the biggest departure from the original vocal style was Tony Azito as the police sergeant. Originally written for a bass, Azito instead performed the number in his normal nasal register. Combined with his loose-limbed acrobatic movement, it was perhaps the clearest departure in characterization between the Savoyards and the Shakespeareans. Of course, movement as a whole was broader and wilder than in the past. Much of that can be credited to choreographer Graciela Danielle, who gave the pirates their high-stomping dance moves, the police their bumbling antics, and Stanley's daughters their giggly beach party introduction. But among the cast, no one worked up a sweat like Kevin Kline, who took the Errol Flynn inspiration to heart, leaping across the stage in his open-chested shirt, fighting anyone hand-to-hand, including Bill Elliott himself. The production made it clear that they had not removed a word of the original libretto, which was technically true, though there were 3 additions. The Matter Patter from Ruddigore and Sorry Her Lot from Pinafore were both added to give the leads further features in Act 2, while the operetta's original finale, long replaced since its 1879 debut, was reconstructed by Richard Trabner from archival scores. But even with these additions, the lead creatives were quick to assure doubters that they had the best intentions at heart. Joe Papp.
What we have to do artistically is make sure it doesn't clash. We have to weave it into a kind of fabric where Gilbert and Sullivan dominate.
Bill Elliott.
The last thing I wanted to do was destroy Sullivan. I'm a composer myself, and I have too much respect for the integrity of the material to want to impose myself on it to the point of annihilating the original. None of us were trying to be different just for the sake of novelty.
Opera critic Peter G. Davis reviewing the production's cast album in 1981.
The smartest decision on the producer's part was to trust the strength of the operetta's basic material. Minor adjustments in the text, a few transpositions in key, and 2 musical numbers inserted from other GNS works hardly amount to major tampering. This is still the Pirates of Penzance in all its important essentials, without updated dialogue, tricked out melodic lines, or reharmonizations.
But speaking of tampering, here's Rupert Holmes talking about Pirates the Penzance musical.
I always felt that the Major General has this iconic number in Act 1, but in Act 2 he has a rather dreary ballad that comes at an awkward moment. He can't sleep, tormented by guilt over a lie, so I thought, why not give him a nightmare song from Iolanthe to express that? It gave us 2 major musical moments for him and helped tighten the narrative. Frederick doesn't have a solo in the original first number, which seemed unfair, so we added a celebratory hand-clapping announcement song for him, adapted from Iolanthe again, to highlight his liberation and set the tone. I always felt Ruth was never handled properly. Once she's dismissed, she hangs around because she's around for Cat Like Tread, but in most productions, if she's lucky, she pairs off with one of the pirates without dialogue, or maybe she pairs off with the Pirate King without any explanation. It's just for the last number they sing.
When you put them side by side like that, the difference is pretty stark. Leach and Elliott brought in a cast that could enliven and expand on the material Gilbert and Sullivan had written. Ellis and Holmes brought in a cast that generally fit the roles, then rewrote those roles to better fit the skills of the actors they had. Ronstadt eschewed her own stardom to learn a new vocal style and meld into the role, while Monsoon was given a new song from outside the show, reorchestrated into a new style, with new lyrics from Holmes that have her literally name-dropping herself.
The situation stinks. I guess that I'm a jinx.
which is to say nothing of how Holmes's rewrites blunt the satirical edge of Gilbert's original lyrics. Far from being just purposeless fun, the original Pirates of Penzance is a satire of the English class system, starting from the very top of the show. The Pirate King's introductory number is a blistering mock of the British aristocracy, whom he claims are just as brutal as the pirates, but at least the pirates are honest about it.
Many a king on a first-class throne, if he wants to call his crown his own, must manage somehow to get through more dirty work than ever I do.
Sarah Holdren, writing for Vulture, brings this up in reviewing Pirates the Penzance musical.
As Holmes rejiggers practically every line of the character's swashbuckling anthem, he manages to drain the song of all its actual politics. "No, Frederick, it cannot be," says the original Pirate King when his apprentice urges him to give up the sword for civilization. "I don't think much of our profession, but contrasted with respectability, it is comparatively honest." There, in one zinger, is more keen humor than can be found in most of Ellis's production.
I am the Pirate King. Yes, it's good when you are the king. Though the throne is lonely, I own it only, it's mine 'cause I'm the king.
Another review from Zachary Stewart at Theatre Mania also comments on the ham-fistedness of some of the rewrites.
Climbing over Rocky Mountain is now We're Sashaying Through the Old French Quarter, which doesn't scan as well and attempts to rebrand the Stanley sisters as suffragists with lyrics like, "Spurned by the 14th Amendment, equal rights was its intendment, but we've checked the details, not for females." It's cringe-inducing, but not nearly as much as the finale, an import from Pinafore that reimagines the tongue-in-cheek patriotism of He Is an Englishman as a celebration of immigration titled We're All From Someplace Else, which makes no sense as nativism is only introduced as a source of conflict in the preceding few lines.
Perhaps the most succinct, cutting description of the production comes from Jesse Green, who described the show in the New York Times as having a sweaty quality bordering on frenzy that's hopelessly at odds with the cool wit of the original. It's apt, in more sense than one, to describe the whole affair as sweaty. In a literal sense, given that Ramin Karimloo is literally glistening in every production photo, but also in the more modern sense that sees sweaty as a synonym for desperate. Pirates the Penzance musical is so nervous about the 140-year-old source material, so scared that it won't be enough for audiences, that they will throw in or throw out anything if they think it will keep people engaged. I do want to reiterate, before I go on dunking on this production any further, that Roundabout, Holmes, and Ellis are allowed to do this. I may not like the end result, but the double-edged cutlass of public domain means that any adjustment is well within their rights. And even beyond that, I am the last person you will find defending original practice. But there's innovation and there's renovation, and the overwhelming sense I get when looking into the changes made to Pirates the Penzance musical is that the lead creatives didn't so much want to do the Pirates of Penzance as much as they wanted to build a new musical out of the bones of an old operetta, while still retaining the positive associations that audiences have over the original work. As Sarah Holdren writes in her review,
"Somewhere on the fundamental level, the show's team is missing the point and making up their own, which might not grate as much if the substitution weren't so flimsy. Solid timber has been swapped for balsa wood."
Which, again, is fine, but if that's the goal, then why bother to claim it's the audience's fault for not connecting to the original material? Conversely, if Roundabout is going to claim that their only intention is to make Pirates relevant, and that the only way to do that is extensive rewrites, then how do we square that with the Leach production, which made only extremely minor changes and arguably achieved the same result?
The director, Wilford Leach, plans to unembalm the piece from the formalities of the doily cart tradition. Indeed, the production's underlying proposition is the same one that has animated the Shakespeare Festival from the beginning. As Joseph Papp says,
"We wanted to bring this classic into a more popular arena and bring in certain performers who would attract people who would not ordinarily go to Gilbert and Sullivan."
Frank Rich, reviewing the show in its Broadway transfer, summed it up nicely.
By rethinking, but not rewriting, Gilbert and Sullivan's work in the highly charged terms of modern musical comedy, Mr. Papp and company have gained the best of both worlds. Indeed, they have united civilized British wit and American showbiz know-how in a combustive Broadway musical.
Again, I should be clear that I'm not against rewrites as a rule. Sometimes tweaks can be necessary or helpful, especially with material this old. My main complaint is about lessons not learned from the 1980 production. If you want to make Pirates relevant, we proved 45 years ago that you don't need to rewrite the whole thing in order to do that. And, as it turns out, we've also proved that you can rewrite Pirates without it coming across as sweaty and desperate. Because we did that 19 years ago. In 2006, Goodspeed Musicals, a regional theater company in Connecticut with a long history of developing new musicals, announced a new staging of The Pirates of Penzance. The production was spearheaded by 3 lead creatives: director Gordon Greenberg, book writer Nell Benjamin, and music director and supervisor John McDaniel. Their goal? Reconceive the classic Gilbert and Sullivan operetta with an eye towards another story of pirates that was newly ascendant in pop culture.
Oh, bugger.
Yes, just 6 months before the release of Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Man's Chest, Goodspeed Musicals announced that they would jump on the pirate bandwagon with a rewrite of Gilbert and Sullivan that would relocate the story to the Caribbean. If you've never heard about this rewritten version of the show, that's likely because it never performed on Broadway. However, unlike Roundabout's revival of Pirates, which only performed in New York, this version of Pirates was restaged all around the country. After running at Goodspeed in October 2006, the same creative team restaged it at New Jersey's Paper Mill Playhouse in June 2007, Boston's Huntington Theater Company in May 2009, and St. Louis' The Muni in July and August of 2012. But aside from the setting, what adjustments did this version of Pirates make? Well, the title, for one. Much like it happened at Roundabout, the Greenberg production was first announced as The Pirates of Penzance, before dropping the definite article and running at Goodspeed as simply Pirates of Penzance. By the time it reached Paper Mill, it had been retitled to simply Pirates! Out of a desire to distinguish it as a clear rewrite. When Huntington announced their 2008-9 season, it was again called The Pirates of Penzance, but by the following year it was retitled as Pirates! Gilbert and Sullivan Plundered, and it was that title that it reused when it was remounted at the Muni. Also, given that we're now discussing 4 different versions of Pirates between the 1879, 1980, 2006, and 2025 productions, I'm going to standardize their titles here by referring to the original operetta as Original Pirates and the revivals by their directors: Leach Pirates, Greenberg Pirates, and Ellis Pirates. I'm going to have to write the word pirates so many times in the captions. Greenberg and playwright Nell Benjamin estimated that around 50 to 60% of the libretto for the show was rewritten, not just to shift the setting, but also to give the show a more irreverent tone, mocking more openly the history of British colonialism and the conventions of light opera itself.
We've all got guns, we've all got knives, we've all got self-esteem that's very low.
Like Leach Pirates, they retained nearly the entire original score, but made 2 adjustments, replacing the Major General's Sighing Softly to the River with The Nightmare from Iolanthe. Incidentally, Ellis Pirates made the exact same substitution, and adding a song after the opening number, Sir Rupert Murgatroyd from Redagore, retitled here as The Curse. The curse in question is the biggest adjustment that Benjamin made to the show's plot, as she explains.
One of the things I thought about was that the pirates in the original story are constantly talking about wanting to marry these daughters. They're fixated on the prospect, and you don't really think of pirates as the marrying kind. That became my idea for the curse. Why did they want to marry them? Well, because they have to.
Specifically, the pirates must be engaged in piracy while on land, or else they will lose their land legs, a curse that can only be broken if they marry a virgin. This new motivation is why Frederick must find a partner so quickly after ending his apprenticeship, and why he spurns Ruth in O False One as he discovers that she's not a virgin. The show also features a more explicit division between Mabel, a brunette scientist, and the rest of Stanley's daughters, all blondes. It's Mabel, not the Major General, who first calls the police to help capture the pirates, and Mabel who figures out the loophole that, while marrying pirates is not socially acceptable, that if the sisters do marry them, then they wouldn't be pirates anymore, making it acceptable again. The show ends with Major General Stanley, now governor of the unnamed island, giving all the pirates jobs in the government, as their ruthlessness makes them uniquely qualified. This all speaks to the goals of Benjamin's rewrites, not to alter the original plot too significantly, but to create new motivations to drive the original plot. The Caribbean setting certainly affects the scenic and costume design for the show, as well as the arrangement of some of the music.
Everybody needs a pirate show. Pirates, 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 pirates.
But the shift in locale is not treated as simply an aesthetic change. Greenberg and Benjamin stated as much in interviews.
A lot of what had been poking fun at Victorian politics and social mores in the original has shifted. We started to poke fun at basic pirate mythology and British colonialism. We set it mid to late 18th century, technically. It's the very end of the golden age of piracy. We imagine that it's not unlike the Bahamas, where at that time, the British were sending governors to kind of tame the pirates and harness the trade industry, to wrest it away from the locals.
This is perhaps the most glaring difference between Greenberg Pirates and Ellis Pirates, and the reason why, despite having seen neither of them myself, I feel less frustration with the former than I do with the latter. One gets the sense that while it was relying on audience knowledge of original pirates to some degree, it was trying to tell its own story, a newer take on the material that engaged with the same moral at the heart of the original. Despite being so rooted in Gilbert and Sullivan, Greenberg Pirates was always framed in marketing as something new, as an adaptation of another work, as something distinct from a revival of the old show. And more to the point, unlike Ellis Pirates, the co-creators never framed their rewrites as trying to fix errors in the original.
Nell is a huge, avid fan of all things Gilbert and Sullivan, and has been for many years. I knew about her affinity and deep respect for the work. The original operetta has always been a favorite. It's indisputably a work of brilliance, and what we were aiming to do was a kind of takeoff on it, or a riff, rather than attempting to recreate it. To me, the most important thing was maintaining and amplifying the kernel of what they were satirizing, which is the fine line between piracy and respectability. It's often hard to tell the difference between a pirate and a hedge fund manager, is kind of the way I went into it. Audiences get that. I really wanted to bring that into the fore.
Add to that consideration that Greenberg Pirates was developed across multiple non-profit spaces. Yes, admittedly with an eye towards Broadway. There were discussions as far back as Goodspeed about a potential New York transfer. But the show was workshopped and developed with an eye towards refining the adaptation, not necessarily the whole production along with it. While Ellis Pirates was rewriting material to match the skills of specific actors, Greenberg Pirates was swapping out cast and team members across all 4 stagings. The material for the Pirate King had to play well no matter who was singing it, be it Andrew Valera at Goodspeed and Papermill, Steve Kazee at Huntington, or Hunter Foster at the Muni. The scenic elements differed greatly between productions, with the Papermill production in particular being so bare bones that it was advertised initially as a staged concert, before scaling up to the massive Muni stage. Even core team members came and went. The latter 2 stagings were choreographed by Dennis Jones, but the first 2 were choreographed by Warren Carlyle, the same choreographer who did Ellis Pirates, who said this in an interview.
So I have some recollection, some knowledge of Gilbert and Sullivan in its classic form. I knew of it in America. Of course, I know the famous Kevin Kline, the Delacorte production.
What are you hiding, Warren Carlyle? Why would you not mention that you've worked on a rewritten version of Pirates before? I'm not even accusing him of anything, it's just a weird thing to leave out. You've choreographed with Cat-Like Tread 3 times. All this to say, Greenberg Pirates was a version of the Pirates of Penzance. A heavily reworked version, a version standing on its own land legs, but an adaptation, a script, a jumping off point for future artists to make their own version of. There was an eye towards recontextualizing Pirates, making it into more of a musical while still respecting the artistry that went into the original, and doing their own thing with it. And never, not once, did they frame the edits as necessary because a general audience was too stupid to enjoy Gilbert and Sullivan. And for those reasons, Greenberg Pirates is undeniably the 21st century revival of this material that actually took the lessons of Leach Pirates to heart. As mentioned, The Pirates of Penzance has always been one of the most produced Gilbert and Sullivan operettas, up there with The Mikado and HMS Pinafore. But the true impact of Leach Pirates may be in how it inspired non-Savoyard companies to stage their own versions of it. Because, while Pirates and the other GNS works remained popular, they were still considered by the general public to be light operas, not musicals. To the average theater fan in the 1970s, The Pirates of Penzance had more in common with The Barber of Seville than it did with A Chorus Line. This was one of the reasons it was such a jolt for Joe Papp to select it for the summer season at all. It would be the modern-day equivalent of your local musical theater company announcing a season consisting of Fiddler on the Roof, Grease, Come From Away, and La Traviata. It's not, like, wrong, but it's unexpected, and you immediately wonder if they have the artistic talent to pull it off. But in the aftermath of the Broadway run of Leach Pirates, suddenly any theater had tacit permission to do pirates anywhere. A national tour introduced musical theater fans to this new high-energy take on Gilbert and Sullivan, as did a 1982 West End transfer of the production, which starred Tim Curry as the Pirate King.
And live and die a pirate king.
The same year, the New York Times reported on 3 dinner theaters within spitting distance of New York City, all of which were staging pirates that fall. A major revival was staged by Canada's Stratford Festival in 1985, which didn't depart as much from the original Savoyard style, but nonetheless benefited from an increased audience interest in the work. Another major production was the 1994 SG Entertainment version, staged in Australia and starring John English as the Pirate King. Even compared to Leach, director Craig Schaefer went even further with deviating from standard practice, adding more comedy, improv, and jabs at conventions of operetta.
Let's go!
It wasn't me, it was one of the musicians.
Which musician?
Oh, no, it wasn't a musician, it was a drummer, sorry.
Also, both the Stratford and SG productions were filmed, allowing a new generation to grow up watching a version of Pirates that felt more contemporary and less stuffy than the old television presentations by the doily cart. Leach's production was also converted into a formal film adaptation in 1983, with the original cast returning except for Ruth, now played by Angela Lansbury. The film further cemented Leach's vision for the show into the public consciousness, for audiences who may have not even known the film was based on a Broadway revival. By the turn of the century, pirates had evolved in the public's imagination. Pinafore and Mikado were still operettas, but Pirates was a musical. Which is not to say opera companies stopped staging pirates. Far from it. The increased popularity led to new stagings by the English National Opera in 2004, Chicago's Lyric Opera also in 2004, Opera Australia in 2006, which was also filmed, the New York City Opera in 2007, Scottish Opera in 2013, the English National Opera again in 2015, and a 2017 production at the Lyric Opera of Kansas City that continues to be remounted at different companies to this day. On the day this video was filmed, it opened at Seattle Opera as their first ever production of Gilbert and Sullivan. And the impact of Leach's staging goes further than just encouraging more productions. The show set a new benchmark for what The Pirates of Penzance was supposed to look and sound like. Ahead of the 1982 West End transfer, Bill Elliott actually sued a Dublin production for copying his orchestrations. While Pirates is obviously in the public domain, Elliott's reduced orchestration was distinct enough to warrant its own copyright protection, and companies wishing to use them can now license the public theater version of the script from Music Theatre International. But other creative elements are less easily protected from replication. Patricia McGordy's costumes, for example, deviated from the expected look of the show in ways that can still be seen today. McGordy was the first person to put Major General Stanley in a khaki uniform, pith helmet, and parasol, as opposed to the classic red military jacket and white plumed hat. But nowadays, pith-helmeted, parasol-wielding major generals show up across numerous revivals, even in companies not using the MTI script. See also the Pirate King's open-chested shirt or the Police Brigade's Keystone Cops physicality, details invented for the 1980 production that have become their own kind of standard. Even the diehards, the Savoyard companies who exist to keep Gilbert and Sullivan's works alive, have softened to allow for more variability in their staging practices. As Schonberg said in 1980,
"This may not have been The Pirates of Penzance as done by the Doily Cart Group in its best days, but there is no longer such a thing as best days. The official Gilbert and Sullivan company in England is a shadow of what it used to be. A few small companies struggle to carry on the traditions, but they are handicapped by lack of funds and physical resources. The Gilbert and Sullivan traditions are vanishing."
Or Peter G. Davis commenting in 1981,
The doily cart productions have become so mummified in recent years that most Britishers have become completely soured on the subject of GNS. The company is apparently even threatened with extinction through lack of audience support. These operettas can withstand almost anything, it seems, except the stifling weight of their own traditions.
As it turns out, their words were prophetic, with the Doily Cart Opera Company finally closing down in 1982, 3 months before Leach's production opened on the West End. But despite this, Gilbert and Sullivan societies still flourish worldwide, for whom the mission has evolved from static replication to a more playful goal of keeping the material alive and dynamic. By sheer coincidence, the Gilbert and Sullivan Opera Company of Chicago also staged Pirates this past summer, running at the same time that Ellis Pirates was on Broadway. It's on YouTube in full, and while the vocal style and staging are obviously a bit stiffer than a musical theater company, the impact of the Leach production 45 years later can still be felt. There's the Matter Patter added from Ruttigore. There's the Major General's pith helmet and parasol. There's Frederick adding comic riffs to the ending of Oh, Is There Not One Maiden Breast? It's not accurate to claim that Papp's Pirates killed off Savoyard traditions. They'd already been dying for several years. But it likely is fair to claim that Papp's Pirates almost single-handedly made the Pirates of Penzance into a bankable draw for non-Savoyard audiences. Before the Broadway transfer, Leach commented,
"Nobody in their right mind would put on Gilbert and Sullivan as a way to make money. Certainly there was never even the remotest thought that it was commercial. Papp didn't think to do it. None of us thought to do it. We thought it was going to be on for a few weeks and that was it."
And yet, here we are, nearly half a century later, and Pirates is the only operetta that your high school drama club could announce tomorrow, and no one would bat an eye. In this vein, Greenberg Pirates and Ellis Pirates are both operating within the new world that Leach Pirates brought into being. Both productions may have had the intention to re-edit and modernize Pirates, but their confidence that audiences would even want to see a re-edited Pirates is a direct consequence of the 1980 revival and all that came after. Which is what makes it so weird to me when I hear team members of the 2025 production say stuff like this.
We know that some young people have a hard time embracing things from the past.
I feel like stuff like Gilbert and Sullivan can feel very unattainable or like it's not for them.
I wanted to bring the show into a world that resonates now, where the music isn't just light operatic tradition, but something vibrant and alive.
Like, I would understand that mentality of let's wipe the dust off the old relic if you were attempting to revitalize the Gondoliers or Princess Ida, GNS operettas that people may have never heard of. But Pirates? Pirates is like the one operetta that audiences don't think is dusty and old. It's the only show in the GNS canon that could easily pull a musical theater audience by itself. And deep down, I think that the Roundabout team know that. And you know how I know that they know? Because they were so desperate to rely on the name recognition of the original operetta that they shoved the word Penzance into this new pretzel knot of a title, despite the show not taking place there. If you really didn't think audiences would want to see the Pirates of Penzance, then you would not have bothered to subtitle it The Penzance Musical.
Anybody here from Penzance? No!
There's a longer conversation to be had about the intentions of these two revivals, how Leach Pirates made it to Broadway unexpectedly after a very successful off-Broadway run, while Ellis Pirates was designed from the ground up with an eye towards running in a for-profit Broadway venue. I'm not saying that Roundabout's rewrites are cynical or profit-driven. They're an off-Broadway company. The show is always intended to have a limited run. Recouping the costs was basically impossible. But the practical considerations of what an audience will attend for free in the park versus what they will attend for $90 on Broadway do have an impact on the content of the show. And if I wanted this video to be an hour longer, this is where I would go on a rant about the trend of gimmicks in post-pandemic Broadway. The new mentality of producers that Broadway shows need to be experiences that you can only get in one place, whether that means A-list actors or extreme production elements, and the long impact this has for regional theaters who will never be able to produce local productions of shows that premiered on Broadway because no one wants to watch Death Becomes Her without the costumes, or Back to the Future without the visual effects, or Good Night and Good Luck without George Clooney. All trends that Pirates the Penzance musical is a part of, and which another YouTuber can cover. The point is, Leach Pirates wasn't trying to modernize the Pirates of Penzance as much as they were trying to prove that the operetta still had appeal for modern audiences as it was. The goal was to show that Pirates may be 101 years old, but by refusing to treat it like a fragile century-old fossil, we can breathe new life into it. Quoting Schoenberg one final time,
"The nice thing about the Shakespeare Festival performance was its tongue-in-cheek but really affectionate look at the lovely relic. There was, thank goodness, virtually no condescension. With all its tomfoolery on stage, the Papp production, directed by Wilford Leach, did take Pirates seriously. Not one line was cut, not one piece of music omitted. It was a brilliant resolution that translated the idea of the original into a modern conception, without vulgarity or strain."
Perhaps the best way to sum up the impact of Papp's Pirates in a single verb would be this. After a century of tradition, the New York Shakespeare Festival democratized the Pirates of Penzance. It was a production that proved not only that Pirates could be a musical, but that the adjustments necessary to make it one were so simple that any company could do it. And for the past 45 years, people have. In my original video about Pirates, I compared Leach's desire to throw out the old Savoyard rules with the European term regitheater, a growing trend among mid-20th century avant-garde directors to ignore the accumulated traditions around the correct way to stage certain texts. Examples of these from the decade preceding Leach Pirates include Peter Brook's 1970 Midsummer and Trevor Nunn's 1976 Macbeth, both at the Royal Shakespeare Company, or Patrice Charot's 1976 staging of the Ring Cycle at the Bayreuth Festival. That said, staying in the world of musical theater, it may be better to see Leach's separation of performance text and performance tradition as the beginning of a trend that continues today in productions like Cats the Jellicle Ball. Yes, directors Jalen Livingston and Bill Rausch did alter the story from being about literal cats to being about a drag ball, but the real innovation of their revival was showing everyone how little about the cat's libretto needed to be altered to accommodate that new conception. After 40 years, the original West End staging, with its Gillian Lynne choreography and John Napier designs, had been codified in popular culture as what the musical Cats looked like, and it took Livingston and Rausch to open our eyes to the fact that, no, actually, Cats can look like whatever we want it to look like, can be about whatever we want it to be about. Other productions making similar throw-out-the-rulebook moves include Bard College's 2015 Oklahoma, which became the Tony-winning revival, as well as Alliance Theater's 2019 staging of The Wizard of Oz, or Pasadena Playhouse's 2019 staging of Little Shop of Horrors. Perhaps the most direct comparison that can be made to Leach Pirates is the 1993 Sam Mendes-directed revival of Cabaret at the Donmar Warehouse. Like Pirates, Cabaret had plenty of performance traditions that had developed since its debut in 1966, and audiences in '93 would have known what the show was supposed to look like. But Mendes's revival, with Alan Cumming as the MC, was such an enormous departure from the expected aesthetic, and such a massive hit on both Broadway and the West End, that, like Leach's Pirates, it effectively created its own performance tradition on top of the original one. Today, regional productions of Pirates and Cabaret are more likely to be replicating the aesthetics of their respective 1980 and 1993 revivals, more so than their 1879 and 1966 original stagings. The reclassification of the Pirates of Penzance as a musical in the popular imagination as opposed to an operetta is also part of an ongoing trend. Before the term musical was codified into its own medium, separate from light opera or vaudeville, pieces like The Threepenny Opera or Porgy and Bess debuted under the label of opera before being reclassified as proto-musicals in light of changing trends. Nowadays, both pieces could be labeled either way, depending on what company is producing them. And this can go in the opposite direction as well. Sweeney Todd and Candide both debuted as musicals before being taken up by opera companies and finding a place in the modern repertory. Sweeney has managed to straddle both labels, being produced frequently at all levels of production, while Candide's combination of not great libretto and incredibly difficult score has led to it being almost exclusively produced by opera companies in the 21st century. Then again, what's important to note about these examples of, I guess you'd say, medium reclassification, is that it's a shift of performance style and marketing, but distinctly not of content. Operatic productions of Sweeney Todd do not add in songs from A Little Night Music to better showcase their performers. Cats the Jellicle Ball did not rewrite the lyrics out of a fear that T.S. Eliot's 1930s poetry would be too difficult to understand. Pirates the Penzance musical would be more accurately described as a revisal, the term for revivals of older works where significant rewriting is done, often not by the original artists. Sometimes these can be to improve on older material that has aged poorly or that simply wasn't well received in the past. Examples on Broadway include Annie Get Your Gun 1999, Flower Drum Song 2002, or the production that arguably invented the trend, the 1971 revisal of No No Nanette. But in recent years, we've also seen a growing trend of revisals for musicals that are still commonly produced in their original form. The Music Man and Camelot are both fairly established in the musical theater canon, and yet their most recent revivals, in 2022 and 2023 respectively, still featured a ton of rewrites. Although I think that those examples, along with Pirates 2025, are less about improving old material and more about making their revivals distinct from other regional productions. About creating a version of The Music Man that you have to see on Broadway because only this version has the rewritten My White Knight with its patter song verses because we cast an actress for name recognition rather than fitness to the role. Again, I could go on about modern Broadway, but not here. Actually, compared with Aaron Sorkin's Camelot or Hugh Jackman and Meredith Willson's The Music Man Sutton Foster, I can respect that the retitling of Pirates the Penzance musical makes it more explicitly clear that rewrites have happened, rather than trying to slip new material in under the guise of a familiar title. However, that's also why it should have been classified as a new musical rather than as a revival, but that's on the Tony Eligibility Committee. I could go on. Pirates, Gilbert and Sullivan Plundered is also a revisal, but one that strikes me as having an artistic drive behind it. They didn't revise the show because the original was inadequate or to add gimmicks. They did so because it was a public domain work that they liked and wanted to bring a new spice to. And if the creatives behind Pirates the Penzance musical had claimed the same purpose, I would dislike their revival less. But they didn't. They claimed that the original Pirates of Penzance wasn't enough, that revisions were the only way to get a contemporary audience to care. Which is a massive indication to me that they missed the most important lesson of the 1980 revival. It doesn't take much to make people like Pirates. All you have to do to make people care about it is to care about it yourself. There's a bitter irony, in my view, in how the efforts of the artists putting together Pirates the Penzance musical mirrors the exclusivity of the doily cart in its heyday. Not in their veneration of the material, but in the implied statement of the production, that only certain professionals get to do Pirates. Limiting the operetta to people who can mimic the blocking and sing in the correct style seems, to me, just as restrictive as crafting a version of the show that incorporates a bunch of star performers and heavy rewrites, all in service of a production that will only run for 4 months and will likely never be licensed or produced again. By comparison, Joseph Papp and Wilford Leach proved that all you need to do the Pirates of Penzance is a handful of musicians, a single separate act, an ensemble trying their very best at the score, a pirate king willing to nearly destroy his body through physical comedy, and a strong sense of trust. Trust in themselves, trust in the material, and trust in the mission of the public theater. For, just as Joe Papp argued that Shakespeare in the Park was a public good, and everyone should have access to Shakespeare's plays, so too did the 1980 revival of the Pirates of Penzance prove that Gilbert and Sullivan does not belong to the Savoyards, or the Doily Cart, or Broadway producers, but to all of us.
I am very well acquainted too with matters mathematical. I understand equations both as simple and quadratical. About binomial theorem and teeming with a lot of news. Lot of news, lot of news. Ah, with many cheerful facts about the square of the hypotenuse.